An older black woman is humiliated by a racist employee in a bank, treated as if she had no rights. But what no one knew was that she was the largest shareholder of the bank. What will happen when they discover her true power? Will it be enough to make them pay for their disrespect? The sunlight filtered gently through the bank's windows, reflecting on the marble tables and the pristine walls. Outside, the city buzzed with its constant rhythm, but inside the building, everything seemed calm and orderly, except for one scene that was about to explode. The older woman, dressed in a simple but elegant white linen dress, entered the bank with a firm step. Her skin was a deep brown tone, like dark chocolate, and her hair, now gray, was tied up in an elegant bun. At 70 years old, she had a presence that did not go unnoticed. No one could have guessed that the woman walking toward the counter, with her serene eyes and distinguished demeanor, was one of the largest shareholders of the bank. Her name was Dolores Martinez, and although she didn't need anyone to know, she had decided to keep her true influence at the bank discreet. As she approached the counter, the young employee, a blonde woman in her 30s, looked at her with a mixture of impatience and disdain. It wasn't uncommon for elderly people to take a little longer to understand the processes, and it was even less unusual that, with her accent and appearance, Dolores didn't fit the ideal customer profile for the bank. "How can I help you, ma'am?" asked the employee, not looking her directly in the eye, as if she were just a burden. Dolores, who had been very patient with people's attitudes over the years, felt a small sting of annoyance. But she said nothing. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the counter and, in a soft voice, explained her request. She needed to transfer a considerable amount of money to one of her investments abroad. The young woman, upon hearing the amount, frowned. It was an amount that exceeded what most clients at that branch handled. Her face became arrogant, and although Dolores didn't immediately notice, the employee had already begun to form an opinion. "Are you sure you have enough balance?" the woman asked with a mocking laugh, as if she didn't believe Dolores could handle such an amount of money. The discomfort in the atmosphere became palpable. Dolores noticed it, and for a moment felt a knot in her stomach. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied calmly. But the employee was not satisfied with the answer. With an even more arrogant tone, and without shame, she continued, "Sorry, ma'am, but people like you, well, they usually don't have the financial education to handle such sums. Maybe someone from your family should take care of this." The words hung in the air like an invisible dagger, and Dolores felt a tingling of rage in her chest. Instead of reacting impulsively, she took a deep breath, contained her emotions, and smiled faintly. "I'm perfectly capable of handling my own money, young lady," she said, almost in a whisper. But the employee, unknowingly, had just crossed a line. At that moment, Dolores stepped back and took out her mobile phone. She dialed a known number, her voice firm and controlled, but this time with a slight tone of authority that the young employee had not detected before. "Yes, please connect me with the operations director. It's urgent." The employee, who now saw Dolores in a completely different light, felt uncomfortable. Her attitude had been excessive, and she was beginning to notice something strange in the woman's behavior. She tried to apologize, but Dolores was already immersed in a conversation with someone on the line. A few minutes later, a tall man, dressed in a dark suit and with a serious expression, appeared out of nowhere. He was the branch manager, a man who knew Dolores very well, though not in an obvious way to the employees. He greeted her with a courtesy that left everyone stunned. "Is everything in order, Mrs. Martinez?" he asked, addressing her directly with a nearly imperceptible bow. The young employee, confused, watched as the situation dramatically changed. The woman she had looked down on was not only a VIP client of the bank, but the largest shareholder of the institution. The room fell silent. "Allow me to show you," the director continued as he asked the employee to step aside, visibly nervous, to another part of the office. The young woman, feeling the pressure of the situation, lowered her head and tried to justify her attitude, but Dolores's gaze froze her in place. With the phone in hand, Dolores spoke firmly, detailing each transaction and resolving the issue at hand with a skill that made it clear that, although she kept a low profile, her influence was anything but small. The employee, who didn't know who she had really been dealing with, now looked at the older woman with a mix of surprise and regret. But Dolores, who had already forgiven in her heart, did not allow her anger to show on her face. With a warm but firm smile, she said to the director, "I believe the transfer is ready, right?" "Yes, Mrs. Martinez. Everything is in order," the director replied, with a mixture of respect and caution. The young employee watched, humiliated, unable to believe what had just happened. But Dolores, without making any additional comments, turned around, walked toward the door, and left with a single phrase that echoed in the room. "Next time, make sure you know who you're talking to before making assumptions." The bank door closed gently behind Dolores, leaving a tense atmosphere in the office. The young employee, still in shock, couldn't stop looking at the director, who remained in his place with an expression that shifted between discomfort and concern. "I didn't know," she murmured, unable to articulate more words, as she watched the director cast her a cold look. "Yes, I know. I've already spoken with Human Resources. This will not happen again, believe me," the director replied, his eyes still fixed on the door through which Dolores had just exited. Then, with a softer voice, he added, "No one, and I repeat, no one, should be treated like that in this bank, especially someone as important as Mrs. Martinez." The young employee, visibly embarrassed, remained silent. It wasn't just Dolores' importance that had surprised her, but also the way she had handled the situation. The older woman, with that imposing calm, had shown a grace that the employee herself never would have expected to possess in a similar situation. Meanwhile, Dolores walked slowly toward her car, the wind playing with the folds of her dress. She didn't feel the need to make more of a fuss. The humiliation of the employee was enough to make her understand the lesson. Throughout her life, Dolores had learned that patience, combined with knowledge of her own worth, always gave her an advantage. In her case, people often underestimated her, thinking she was just an older woman with a quiet life. But, as she had demonstrated today, her roots were deeply planted in the soil of power and experience. When she got in her car, the engine started up smoothly. She looked into the rearview mirror and smiled to herself. She had fought many battles in her life, but she had never lost her composure. That was not her way of acting. Money, influence, and power should not be used as tools of humiliation, but as an opportunity to teach others the true value of people. Besides, she wasn't seeking revenge, only justice. The car began to move, and Dolores turned her head, looking toward the horizon. The bank, that place that had been a symbol of her success, no longer mattered as much to her. What truly mattered was that she had demonstrated, not only to the young employee, but to all those who had ever underestimated her, that the value of a person is not measured by their age, appearance, or the color of their skin. Dolores' journey was far from over. She had made a decision years ago. She would not retire until she saw real change in society. And that change was starting, as it always had, from what was closest to her. When she returned home after a long day, Dolores retired to her study, a space filled with books, mementos of her personal history, and papers that, at first glance, might have seemed insignificant. But for her, each of those documents represented a battle won. She sat at her desk and, while looking at her reflection in the window glass, murmured to herself, "This is just the beginning." But they still didn't know that the real battle, the biggest one, was yet to come. She had barely started moving the pieces. That very night, Dolores stayed awake later than usual. She had spent years reflecting on the injustices faced by people like her, but she had never felt as driven as she did now to do something about it. She knew that social change didn't happen overnight, but she firmly believed that every action, no matter how small, counted. With the phone in her hand, she began to search for information. She wasn't looking for something trivial, but specific data, legal strategies, social initiatives, and movements that could help amplify her voice. She knew her influence in the bank was already considerable, but she didn't want to limit herself to such a small field. Dolores thought big. She thought about the future, about what she could build not only for herself, but for those who had never had the chance to make their voices heard. Suddenly, a call came in. It was the branch manager, the same man who had been present earlier that afternoon. "Mrs. Martinez, I deeply regret today's situation," he said, his voice tense. "I want to assure you that we have taken internal measures. The employee has already been suspended while an investigation is conducted. We don't want this to happen again." Dolores smiled softly, but didn't show emotion on her face. It was a response that didn't surprise her, but one that still seemed insufficient. "That's fine, but what happens next?" she asked, calmly, but with a decisive clarity. "What will you do to change the culture within your bank? This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern that needs to be transformed. I would like to see a real awareness program, not just disciplinary measures." The director fell silent for a moment, as if Dolores's words had the weight of a sentence. "I was thinking about that, Mrs. Martinez. I'm willing to propose it, but I will need your help to give it weight. Would you be willing to actively participate in designing a diversity and inclusion program within the institution?" Dolores didn't hesitate. She knew this was a unique opportunity, an opportunity to make a real difference. "Of course, I'll be involved. And I want it to be more than just a superficial program. I want real measures to be implemented that change the way people like me are seen within the system. Not just for what I represent economically, but for who we are, people with history, with experiences, with the same right to be respected." The director agreed, and Dolores felt that, finally, she was taking control of the situation on a broader scale. But her mind kept working. It wasn't enough for the bank to adopt new policies, nor was it enough for the employee to be sanctioned. No, Dolores wanted something that would leave a mark on society, something that could inspire others to fight against the racism and discrimination that still persisted insidiously in many corners of the world. As the days went by, Dolores began meeting with human rights experts, leaders of social organizations, and other shareholders of the bank who, like her, understood the weight they carried in the financial industry. Her goal was clear: to establish an investment fund to support marginalized communities, particularly those led by women of color, to promote access to education, health care, and above all, the opportunity to start their own businesses. Her initiative began to gain momentum. Several local media outlets began talking about her, and the news of her influence in the bank started to spread, not only as the story of the older woman who had been insulted, but as the story of a woman who, without losing her dignity, had used her power to provoke real change. But not everyone viewed Dolores's actions positively. Some of the other shareholders of the bank began to feel uncomfortable with the direction she was taking the institution. For them, the policies of inclusion and diversity were a threat to the status quo, a challenge to the practices that had kept the financial system intact for years. In one of the most important meetings with the senior executives, one of the most influential shareholders, a businessman known for his unconventional methods and aggressive market approach, confronted Dolores directly. "I don't understand what you're trying to do with all of this, Mrs. Martinez," he said, with a cold smile. "The bank has been functioning perfectly well for years without us having to get involved in social issues. We're here to make money, not to do activism." Dolores, with her characteristic poise, looked him straight in the eye. Her response was direct, without hesitation. "What I'm aiming for, sir, is something much bigger than just making money. I'm here to change the world. And if that means I need to transform the way a bank operates, then I will. Because at the end of the day, money only has value if it serves something greater: justice, equity, and the common good." The man, visibly irritated, stood up from the table and, without saying anything else, left the room. Dolores remained in her place, her gaze fixed on the rest of the shareholders. Though she knew the resistance would be fierce, she was ready to fight for her cause. Not just for herself, but for all those who, like her, had been ignored, marginalized, or treated as if they didn't matter. With the support of those who shared her vision, Dolores was ready for a confrontation that could redefine the way the bank operated, and perhaps, just perhaps, change something bigger than that. The battle had only just begun. The following weeks were filled with tension and maneuvering in the hallways of the bank. Dolores faced increasing resistance from some of the most powerful shareholders, who saw her initiatives as a direct threat to their interests. But she wasn't intimidated. With every meeting, with every proposal she put forward, her presence became more imposing. The changes weren't easy, nor were they quick. However, Dolores knew that the most important battles were never won immediately. Her fight extended beyond the bank. She began working with non-governmental organizations, called for conferences and seminars on racial and gender equality, and promoted a shift in mindset that transcended the walls of financial institutions. Her vision was much broader than simply creating an inclusion program within a bank. She wanted a revolution in the way businesses and governments treated marginalized people. Meanwhile, the young employee who had insulted Dolores, now suspended, began to reflect on her behavior. During her time away from the bank, she realized how wrong she had been in judging the older woman. Through her own process of self-awareness and education, she understood that racism isn't always displayed openly and violently. It hides in small gestures, in seemingly innocent comments, and those acts have a real impact on people's lives. The feeling of shame and regret consumed her, but also drove her to change. When she was called back to the bank, she came in with a different attitude, more humble and eager to learn. Dolores, for her part, continued her fight. After months of hard work, tense discussions, and difficult negotiations, she began to see the fruits of her efforts. The bank adopted new diversity policies, implemented investment funds to support disadvantaged communities, and opened spaces for dialogue within the institution to educate employees about racism and discrimination. In her last major meeting with the shareholders, Dolores stood up, aware of the battle she had fought. Her voice resonated firmly and clearly in the boardroom. Today, I don't celebrate a personal victory, but a victory for all those who have not had a voice. We've taken a step, but the journey doesn't end here. This is only the beginning. We need to keep working, not just to change the bank, but to change society as a whole. The shareholders, some still reluctant, began to applaud. Although not all of them agreed with her completely, they couldn't deny the impact she had made. Dolores had accomplished something many thought impossible. She had transformed a financial giant from the inside, not just with power, but with solid principles. At the end of that meeting, Dolores left the bank building with a sense of satisfaction, but also deep reflection. She knew there was still much to be done, that the fight for social justice wasn't won with just one step, but with thousands of small acts of resistance and courage. At home, at the end of the day, she sat by her window, gazing at the illuminated city. She had made a significant turn in her life, a turn that went beyond money and fame. She had taken what had been done to her, what had been said to her, and turned it into something much bigger. Change, after all, didn't just depend on what she could accomplish, but on what others could learn from her example. And as she thought about it, Dolores realized that, ultimately, true power didn't lie in money, nor in large institutions, but in the ability to change hearts, to influence minds, and to leave a mark that would last long beyond her time. With that inner peace, Dolores closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The battle had been tough, but finally, she felt that the world was beginning to see people like her not only with respect, but with a new understanding. And, in a way, she knew this was just the beginning of a revolution that, though quiet, was making noise in every corner of the world. If you like this video, you need to check out these other videos where we tell the most impactful and unjust stories about racism that took an unexpected turn. Click now, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment.